Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 142, Diplomacy. Okay, so today we're covering a game that isn't a tabletop role-playing game, but it is a game that pretty much every old-school gamer has played in at least one of its forms over the years. And if you haven't played it, I highly suggest you should. I can also tell you with a great deal of certainty that today's subject is going to be one of the oldest continually produced and played games that we're going to cover on this show, and there's a damn good reason why it's been produced and played for so many years. So why don't I stop with the hype and just get the tour bus cranked up? Diplomacy was the brainchild of Alan B. Calhammer, who originally created it in 1954. Calhammer came up with the idea for the game from his studies at Harvard of 19th century European history under the tutelage of Sidney B. Fay and from his studies of political geography. Over the years, Calhammer also gave credit for the design of Diplomacy to the card game Hearts, noting that he was intrigued by his observations that players were at an advantage when they teamed up against the leader. He also drew inspiration from chess, which inspired him to use a limited number of spaces and pieces when putting Diplomacy together. That 1954 creation of the game was a very rough form. Calhammer playtested the game for roughly 4 years, making numerous adjustments based on feedback from his players and his own observations of the gameplay. It wasn't until 1958 that he felt the map and rules revisions he'd come up with met the standards he'd been looking for, and it was at that point he believed it was ready for publication. So he set out to find a home for his game with various game companies and came up with no takers. But he wasn't deterred. Calhammer decided to self-publish and paid for a 500-game run out of his own pocket, and that printing was released in 1959. Since then, the board game version of Diplomacy has been released by Games Research in 1961, with a 1971 version that had a revised rulebook, Avalon Hill released in 1976, Avalon Hill again in 1999 when Hasbro took over the company, and the current rights holder Wizards of the Coast in 2008. And that's just in the United States. Board game publishers worldwide hold the rights to Diplomacy and publish versions, among them being Parker Brothers, Waddington's Games, Gibson's Games, and Asmodee Editions. Oh, and for the record, the very first copy of that 1959 print run was sold by the Calhammer estate through an auction in 2017. Now, I wasn't able to find out how much that copy went for, but I have seen copies of the 1961 prints going for anywhere from $200 to $500 online, but those are the asking prices, so who knows how much they're actually selling for. And for those who are curious, Alan Calhammer passed away on February 25th, 2013, at the age of 81 from heart and kidney failure in LaGrange, Illinois. Now, Diplomacy has been played in a number of other formats, and I'd usually cover them in this portion of the show, but I'd like to get into the how-to part of the game first, because I think we need to take a break to explain to the listeners who've never played the game how it works before we dive into some of the other formats it's been played in over the years. And I kind of figured the rest of you wouldn't mind. Okay, so we need to first understand the very basics of Diplomacy. In case some of what I mentioned in the history portion didn't make it clear, this is, for all intents and purposes, a war game. It starts out in 1901, though the map typically lays out the political boundaries of Europe in 1914, which would be just before the beginning of the Great War. And for those of you who aren't quite history savvy, the Great War is also known as World War I. Just making sure we're all on the same page. So on the map, Bosnia is already annexed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Balkans reflect the results of the wars of 1912 and 1913 that took place in the region. Now, Montenegro is shown as a part of Austria-Hungary. Also, North Africa and Tunis are neutral as the game begins, which doesn't affect the reality of the time, as they were both a part of the French colonial empire in 1914. Finland and Syria are both parts of the Great Powers. Finland was part of the Russian Empire. Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire in 1914. Tunis is used rather than Tunisia on most boards, and North Africa is a single province that covers parts of Algeria and Morocco. And yes, it does help if you're a bit of a history nerd like me, if you want to play the game. If not, you might want to read up on your European history of circa 1910 through the end of World War I. So, with the historical stuff out of the way, let's get to the board layout. It's divided into 56 land regions and 19 sea regions. 42 of the land regions are divided among the 7 great powers of the game, and those are Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and Turkey. The remaining 14 land regions are neutral at the start of the game. And if this sounds a bit familiar, yes, the game Risk was based in part on diplomacy. 34 of the land regions have what are called supply centers that correspond to major centers of government, industry, or commerce, like Vienna or Rome. 22 of these are located within the Great Powers and are called home supply centers. The remaining 12 are located in the neutral provinces. The number of supply centers a player controls determines the total number of armies and fleets a player may have on the board, and as players gain and lose control of centers, they may build, or raise as it were, or must remove, or disband as it were, units accordingly. The land provinces within the Great Powers, which contain supply centers, are generally named after a major city in the province, like London or Moscow, while the other land provinces within the Great Powers are generally named after a region, like Bohemia. Neutral land provinces tend to be named after countries like Serbia and Belgium. I should note before I continue that diplomacy can be played by anywhere from 2 to 7 players as originally designed, and it has no dice, so that made it very different from board games of its time. Now, each player has a great power to start the game, and each player other than Britain and Russia has 2 armies and 1 fleet when they begin. Britain has 2 fleet and 1 army, and Russia has 2 armies and 2 fleets, which makes them the only player that has more than 3 units. Only 1 unit at a time may occupy a given map region. Balancing units to supply center counts is done after each game year, which involves 2 seasons of play, spring and fall, and we'll get more into that momentarily. At the beginning of the game, the 12 neutral supply centers are typically captured within the first few moves. Further acquisition of supply centers becomes a zero-sum dynamic, with any gains in a player's resources coming at the expense of a rival. Now, I've sort of set things up, so let's get down to it. As I've mentioned, diplomacy works its way along by seasons and begins in the year 1901, and each year is divided into the 2 main seasons, spring and fall. Each season is divided into negotiation and movement phases, which are followed by retreat or disband adjustments, and an end-of-year winter phase of new builds or removals, which follow the fall adjustments. So let's look at the negotiation phase. That phase goes a lot like you think it would. Players discuss tactics and strategy, form alliances, and share intelligence or spread disinformation. Now, negotiations can be made public or kept private. It should be noted that players are not bound to anything they say or promise, and no agreements are enforceable, just like in the real world. But communication and trust are highly important. I mean, players have to forge alliances with others and observe their actions to evaluate their trustworthiness. At the same time, they have to convince others of their own trustworthiness while making plans to turn against their allies when it's least expected. A well-timed betrayal can be just as profitable as an enduring, reliable alliance. I mean, do I really need to say it again? Anyway, let's take a look at the movement phase. After the negotiation phase concludes, the players write down their orders for each of their units in secret. Once this is done, the orders are all revealed and executed simultaneously. A unit can move from its location to an adjacent space, support an adjacent unit to hold an area in the event of an attack, support another unit to attack a space into which it could move itself, or hold defensively. In addition, fleets may transport armies from one coast space to another when in a chain called a convoy. Armies may only occupy land regions, and fleets occupy sea regions, and the land regions that border named seas. As I mentioned earlier, only one unit may occupy each region. So, because all of these orders are revealed and executed simultaneously, you cannot react immediately to something that's done. That's the simplicity, and that's the genius of the system. If multiple units are ordered to move to the same region, only the unit with the most support moves to that location. If two or more units have the highest support, a standoff occurs and no units ordered to that region moved. A unit ordered to give support that is attacked has those orders canceled and is forced to hold, except in the case that support is being given to a unit invading the region from which the attack originated, in which case the unit that had been ordered to give support must retreat from rather than hold its position. Whew, there's a lot going on there. Certain spaces on the board have two coasts, and here a player must specify which one they want their fleet to occupy. A fleet can only move to coasts and oceans that border the coast that it's on. Here's an example. A fleet occupying the southern coast of Bulgaria cannot move into Romania or the Black Sea, but a fleet on the east coast could. Look, I realize that's a lot to take in, but I wanted to be as thorough as possible in laying out how diplomacy works, especially since I had a ton of research on the game for the show this week, and let's be honest, I didn't do the show last week, so I kind of felt like I had to make it up, so here we go. All right, so let's hit the third and final part of the year, and that's the end of the year and supply centers. We noted that after each fall move, we've got stuff to do, and at that point, newly acquired supply centers become owned by the occupying player, and each power's supply center total is recalculated. Players with fewer supply centers than units on the board must disband units, while players with more supply centers than units on the board are entitled to build units in their open or unoccupied home centers, which are supply centers they didn't control at the start of the game. Players who have lost all of their home centers may not build new units, while players who control no supply centers are eliminated from the game. If a player controls 18 or more, which would be half of the 34 supply centers at the end of a year, are declared the winner. Players who remain at the end of a year may also agree to a draw. And for the record, around half of all the games played will end in a draw. And there's a reason why so many games of diplomacy end in a draw. It can take a long time to play. I've heard of games lasting days and even weeks of real time. So unless you've got a lot of patience, or unless you're just the type who has to have a winner or a loser in everything you do, sometimes calling a draw is just the best outcome. In going through the how-to of diplomacy, I think we've made it pretty obvious how it's different from most of the war games out there, but since there's so much meat on the bone there, I thought I might narrow it down a bit in an easier to digest form. Players don't take turns in a sequence or initiative order. They write down their moves in secret after the negotiation phase, and they're played simultaneously. Social interaction and interpersonal skills are a must. The rules for combat are strategic, abstract, and simple because this is a diplomatic simulation game and not necessarily a military simulation. Combat resolution has no random elements, thus the lack of dice. Each military unit has the same strength. The game board is on the scale of an entire continent rather than a single campaign theater. Land and sea power are almost equally significant. So as we've seen, there's a lot of stuff going on here with diplomacy. And I didn't even get into some of the rules adjustments the various publishers put out over the years. So let's discuss some of those. If you play with 6 players, you leave Italy out. 5 players means you also kick Germany out of there. Now, Avalon Hill suggested later on that if you're not using the full complement of players, You could have players playing multiple countries, but that was something that wasn't always popular, since you'd have people who'd use their two countries as basically one superpower to dominate the rest of the board. So a fellow by the name of Edie Bearson came up with something called the escalation variant rules, and they go like this. When using fewer than 7 players, players start with no pieces on the board. Players put one piece down on the board in any province, one at a time, starting with the youngest player. After reaching the maximum number of pieces, the players start the game with ownership of their starting provinces. At the end of fall 1901, with their adjustments, players write down their 3 home centers for the rest of the game. Now, that final part is done without negotiations and could result in 2 players declaring the same home province, which could still have its own problem. Bearson thought of that and noted that in order to build there, the player would still have to own it and the province would still have to be open. And insofar as how many starting pieces to use, he suggested that with 2 players, you use 12 each. With 3, it's 8 each. 4 get 6 each. 5 get 5 each. And 6 get 4 each. Now, there are multiple other suggestions for how to work things out if you've got less than 7 players, but look, I could spend an hour just covering those, and while we do have all the time in the world to go over those, I really don't know if you'd find it interesting enough to cover, so let's just move on. Now, of course, with something as popular as diplomacy, there are always going to be variants on the theme. I mentioned Risk as being a game based on it, but I'm talking about games that are so close to diplomacy in style and function that they're damn near the same game. Over the years, there have been 6 commercially released variants of the game, and I'm going to take a moment or two to briefly cover them. Machiavelli was published by Battle Line Publications, but was later taken over by Avalon Hill. It was set in Renaissance Italy. The board is controlled by the Republic of Florence, the Republic of Venice, the Duchy of Milan, the Kingdom of Naples, the Papacy, Valois France, Habsburg Austria, and the Ottoman Turks. The game has some twists on diplomacy, as it brings in money, bribery, 3 seasons per year, garrisons, and random events like plague and famine. It has scenarios for as few as 4 players and as many as 8. Commodora was published by West End Games in the early 1980s and was set in feudal Japan. Now, I tried to find some more information on this game, but unfortunately all I could dig up was about a dozen sites selling used copies, so if you've played it, hit me up and tell me about it, and I'll report on it in a future episode. Colonial Diplomacy was published by Avalon Hill in 1994. It was set in Asia in the late 19th century, and as you'd expect from the title, the board is primarily controlled by the various colonial powers of the time. The United Kingdom, the Russian Empire, the Empire of Japan, Holland, the Ottoman Empire, China, and France. Now, this game has a couple of new features we hadn't seen to this point. The Trans-Siberian Railroad is included on the board, and much as it was in the real world at the time, runs from Moscow to Vladivostok. It's available for Russia to move armies anywhere along the railroad and can only be used by Russia. Other armies can't use it, but it can be blocked by other armies. The Suez Canal exists, and it's the only way to move between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. It's controlled by whomever controls Egypt, and of course it becomes more important the longer the game goes on. The ownership of Hong Kong counts as a supply center for any country except China. By the way, Colonial Diplomacy won a tie for an Origins Award for the best pre-20th century board game of 1995. 100 is a map for 3 players by Andy D. Schwarz based on the 100 Years' War created in 1996, and it was published by Stupendous Games in 2000. This is another one I tried to get more info on and was unsuccessful, so you know the drill. Classical is another map from Andy D. Schwarz, along with Vincent Maus, based on the ancient world after the death of Alexander the Great. It was created in 1998 and published by Stupendous Games in 2000. Had the same luck as I had with 100. Last up is Diplomacy of the Three Kingdoms. It's based on the Three Kingdoms in ancient China, and it was created by Edie Beersen to introduce the idea of diplomacy to a Chinese audience with a setting more close to their own historical experience. It was published by MJS Creations in 2008. Again, I tried to find more on that online and was unable to do so. And by the way, those are just the commercially available versions. I can tell you from my research online that there are dozens of non-commercial versions out there that you could check out. Some of those are near professional quality, while others, not so much. If you decide to go online and try the non-commercial versions, I'm just going to say, buyer or downloader, beware. So by now, I know what you're saying to yourself. Wayne, my God, man, you said you were going to get to the other ways diplomacy's being played. We're getting there. I promise. Before we do, I wanted to hit one more topic on the board game, and that's tournaments. My God, are there a bunch of tournaments out there for diplomacy players, which makes sense if you think about it. Some of them are only a day, which tells me they're either speed play tournaments or scored in some fashion. Otherwise, you're looking at a ton of ties. Others are multi-day tournaments, and those tend to either be tied into diplomacy-themed conventions, such as DipCon or DixieCon, or conventions like the Origins Game Fair or the World Board Gaming Championships. Now, one way some tournaments handle the issue I was joking about a moment earlier is to end the game after a specific number of game years. Others continue until either a winner is determined or a draw is voted, just like in a standard game. The first option is pretty much a European standard, while the second is primarily a North American standard. The World Diplomacy Convention is held annually in different places around the world, and the winner of the tournament is considered to be the champion of diplomacy. The tournament was first held in 1988 in Birmingham, England, and was originally held in 2-year intervals before finally becoming an annual event. The site moves among 4 regions: North America, Europe, Australasia, and the rest of the world, with a requirement that successive tournaments are always held in different regions. The North American Diplomacy Convention is held annually in different locations in North America and was first held in Youngstown, Ohio in 1966. Its site rotates among West, Central, and East regions. The European Diplomacy Convention is held annually in different locations around Europe, and over a dozen countries hold annual face-to-face national tournaments. I'd also note that there are multiple play-by-mail tournaments held annually, and the 3 major tournaments are World Masters, which is held every 2 years in the World Masters email tournament, composed of both team and individual events. The Diplomacy World Cup, modeled after the Soccer World Cup. There have been 3 of these. The first took place from 2007 to 2009 and was won by France. The second was from 2010 to 2012 and was won by Ireland. The third was from 2013 to 2015, and even though the internet is a large space, I couldn't find the winner of that one. So if you know who won, let me know. The Winter Blitz is the 3rd major tournament, and it became open to join in 2011. Okay, so since I just mentioned play-by-mail tournaments, let's get into the other ways you can play diplomacy. It should be noted that Diplomacy was the first commercially published game to be played by mail. Only chess saw significant postal play earlier, and since it's in the public domain, it doesn't count as being commercially published. Diplomacy started being played by mail through fanzines in the 1960s. Dr. John Boardman of New York City typically gets the credit for creating the play-by-mail hobby, and he did so by creating carbon-copied, typed flyers and recruited his players in his fanzine called Knowable. That fanzine turned into a long-running publication called Graustark, and it led to other zines being published. And for you gatherers of Jeopardy facts out there, Gary Gygax was a diplomacy play-by-mail player in the 1960s. By May of 1965, there were 8 diplomacy zines out there, and by the end of 67, there were dozens of zines in the U.S. By the end of 1970, the editors of those zines started holding gatherings. In 1969, Don Turnbull started the first UK-based diplomacy zine called Albion. These were called dippy zines, though I have no clue why they were called this. And here's another one of those interesting facts I dig up from time to time. Before 1980, most of these zines had circulation numbers around 50, while a few had numbers in the hundreds. By 1972, both the US and UK diplomacy hobbies were forming official organizations. In the 1980s, there were over 60 zines, like Diplomacy World, in the main list of the North American zine poll, peaking at 72 zines in 1989. There were nearly as many in the major zine poll of the British part of the hobby. Oh, I guess I should note that when I'm calling something a diplomacy zine, I'm talking about a play-by-mail diplomacy game. I'm not talking about a magazine. I'm talking about an actual game. So when I say a zine had 50 subscribers, I mean a diplomacy game had 50 players in it. Just so we're on the same page here. Competition was severe in these things too. In fact, some of the play-by-mail players would go to any lengths to win. Reports from the UK were that some players were engaging in bribery, blackmail, and even going so far as to forging mail from other players or even the game master. And there was even one report of postal interference in which someone altered a letter by forging a postmark, thus causing a player to miss a deadline. Some of these actions actually wound up involving the real police in game situations. I shit you not. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the number of zines decreased as new players took advantage of the advancements of technology that allowed for players to participate in diplomacy sessions via email or on websites. In April of 2010, Graustark ceased publication. As of 2011, there are only a few active postal zines in the US, one each in Canada and Australia, and a few in the UK and elsewhere. In order to reduce postal and printing costs and to reduce the impact on the environment, several of the remaining zines are distributed to subscribers via emailed links to the zine's webpage when a new issue appears, or are emailed as PDF files. For the record, the first known electronic diplomacy zine was Mad as Hell, distributed on Usenet in 1982. Diplomacy has been played through email on the internet since the 1983 debut of the Armchair Diplomat on CompuServe. The Genie online service offered fully automated versions of diplomacy and variants to subscribers. For those who'd prefer to just play diplomacy against the AI of their home computer, we've got you covered. Sort of. Avalon Hill released a computer game version of Diplomacy in 1984 for the IBM PC. Computer Gaming World stated in 1987 that its computer opponents, quote, simply stay the appetite of zealous diplomacy players until they can gather flesh and blood victims, end quote. The magazine in 1984 described it as, quote, a flop, end quote. Hasbro Interactive released a computer game version of Diplomacy in 1999 under the Microprose label called Avalon Hill's Diplomacy. The AI was considered poor, as it was with the 1984 version, and the Yahoo reviewer at the time stated, quote, gamers of any skill level will have no trouble whatsoever wailing on the computer at even the highest difficulty setting, end quote. Paradox Interactive released a new computer version in 2005, which also got negative reviews. AI again was blamed, and this time it got ripped because they added grunts to express the reactions of the AI for their moves during the movement phase. And the AI was still as crappy as it had been during the previous two versions. So maybe we don't have you covered if you want to play Diplomacy on the computer, so sorry about that. Well, let's see if we can end on a high note and get a couple of reviews of the board game. Nick Palmer commented on Diplomacy in his 1977 book, The Comprehensive Guide to Board Wargaming. He noted, quote, the game has an extraordinary charm all its own, based on the fascinating interplay of alliances between the 7 players, end quote. He concluded by stating, quote, this can be strongly recommended to anyone interested in games of multiplayer negotiation, end quote. Game designer John Freeman discussed Diplomacy in his 1980 book, The Complete Book of Wargaming, and called it, quote, Probably the most famous war game in existence, the double dealing required attracts some people irresistibly and repels others just as strongly, but the interaction in diplomacy is the model for all other power politics games, end quote. Freeman did have two issues with the game, quote, the number of players required and the time it takes to play, end quote. He concluded by saying, quote, this is a classic game in every sense of the word, end quote. Diplomacy was inducted into the Academy of Adventure Gaming Arts and Design Adventure Hall of Fame in 1994. Okay, so I realize there's going to be a portion of the audience